Welcome to the Language Alchemy podcast, where we explore how our language and communication patterns directly impact our lives, and where you get transformative communication tools to bring forth more authenticity and compassion to all your relationships. Thank you for joining me today. This is your host, Alejandra Siroka, a communication teacher and coach who is devoted to helping multicultural individuals, change makers, and couples engaged in personal growth experience the lives and relationships they long for through the power of transformative communication. I'm so excited about this episode because we are going to talk about how to break free from what I call the spin cycle. You know that feeling when you think about a long-standing conflict on and on and on? If you listen to the previous episode 174, I talked about the 3 mistakes we make when we have an ongoing conflict with someone. I mentioned that the most exhausting and costly mistake is to keep the conflict looping in our minds for a long time instead of addressing the conflict directly. If you haven't listened to episode 174, I encourage you to check it out after this episode so that you can learn about the 2 mistakes we tend to make. For now, let's focus on how to transform these stuck dynamics using the Language Alchemy approach. Before I teach you what you can do to break free from the spin cycle, I want to warn you about falling into being the quote-unquote better person trap. When my students and clients have a long-held conflict, I usually ask them what they've tried to get out of the spin cycle. And what they tell me is that they're not addressing it with the person they have the conflict with. Instead, they're trying really hard to be the better person. So then I ask, and how is that working out? And what they tell me is not so well. You've probably tried to be the better person too. Or maybe you have received advice from well-meaning people who tell you things like, you just need to be the mature one, or don't come down to their level, take the high road, or turn the other cheek, or just let it go. And while all these pieces of advice do come from a good place, they aren't often helpful. These ideas about being the better person can actually add another layer of pressure because they suggest that if we were truly evolved or mature, we would simply rise above the conflict without addressing the underlying issues. But let me ask you, if you never address your conflicts, how are you going to solve them in ways that feel satisfying to you? And also, this piece of advice of being the better person can feel dismissive of legitimate concerns or boundary violations because it places the entire burden of resolution on one person, you. And it can enable healthy dynamics to continue. Plus, it creates a split between you and the other person. Because if you have to act in a superior way, you have to regard the other person as inferior. But in fact, we're all equally valuable human beings. What I know from personal experience and from what my students and clients tell me is that when you try as hard as you can to be the better person, eventually you start thinking, why am I the only one who has to make every effort to pretend there's no conflict? It builds resentment. You may think the other person isn't doing anything at all, or that they continue making the conflict worse. You may feel that being the better person means allowing the other person to get away with any kind of behavior, even behavior you don't want to accept. As one of my clients told me, Alejandra, it's terrible to have to be the one who has to always try to do the right thing and fall over backwards while the other person is being rewarded for their bad behavior. When people work with me for some time, they realize something important. that when they're trying to be the quote unquote better person, they're not being themselves. When they apply forced niceness to their communication, they're being inauthentic. And inauthenticity doesn't feel good at all. So instead of trying to be the better person, I want to suggest a different approach entirely, a language alchemy strategy. If this resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in this pattern, I bet you know someone else who's also stuck in this cycle. So consider sharing this episode with them. Sometimes all we need to hear is that we are not alone in our struggles. If you have been following me for some time, you heard me say that language alchemy is first and foremost an awareness practice. So first, we need to become aware that we are caught in mental spinning. We need to recognize that while we have a conflict with someone else, we have created a further problem within ourselves. Once we acknowledge this, let's remember Albert Einstein's famous quote, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So we need to consider the problem of mental spinning with a different kind of thinking. We need a different perspective, which of course requires a different kind of language. Instead of using the language of right or wrong, good or bad, friends or enemies, that is to say, divisive and judgmental language, we need to turn to another kind of language. We need a deeper and more meaningful language, which is the language of our values. This is how we engage with the second aspect of language alchemy as a conscious communication approach. We choose to turn our awareness away from right-wrong thinking and towards our values. Instead of trying to find a solution for the conflict by focusing on being better, we then focus on what matters to us. And this is how we start preparing ourselves to communicate in alignment with those values with the person we're in conflict with. To do so, you can ask yourself, if you value respect and dignity, how would you speak to this person in a way that honors both your humanity and theirs? If you value growth and connection, what conversation needs to happen that you have been avoiding? If you value peace and harmony, what boundaries do you need to set? What truths may you need to speak to create genuine peace rather than surface level politeness? When you anchor your communication in your values, instead of avoiding the conversation, this shift can change everything. I've seen it again and again and again. When we approach conflicts from our values, something remarkable happens. We stop spinning in circles and we start moving in a clear direction towards resolution. And that is when we engage in the third aspect of language alchemy, evolutionary activism. Let me explain briefly what I mean by evolutionary activism. It's the idea that when we transform how we communicate in our personal relationships, we are actually contributing to a larger shift in human consciousness. Every time we choose values-based communication over reactive patterns, we're not just healing our own conflicts. We are modeling a new way of being that ripples out into the world. Now that you have the full approach, let's go deeper into the practical application. When we consider how to solve the conflict, we often think about how we are going to convince the other person to change their behavior. We see it as a way of tending to our wounds or as a way of making them pay for their words or the behaviors that hurt us. If we want to get out of the spin cycle and get real about resolving the conflict, we need to transform our internal dialogue. And that has to do with the kind of questions we ask ourselves. Instead of asking ourselves, how do I make this person change? We need to ask, how do I show up as the person I want to be in this situation? Instead of asking ourselves, why does this keep happening to me? We need to ask, what does my value of integrity require of me right now? Does it require me to set a boundary, to be open and listen, to speak with confidence and compassion, to let the other person in and share with them how hurt I felt, to repair the connection and apologize? And instead of asking ourselves, when will I finally get over being triggered by this? We ask, what is this trigger trying to teach me about what I value and need? Is it teaching me about self-worth, generosity, assertiveness? Once we have a conscious dialogue with ourselves, that conscious dialogue moves us away from making ourselves a victim and making an enemy out of the other. We can take the steps to express ourselves authentically and find a solution to the issue. That's when we're ready to take transformative action. Let me give you an example. In the previous episode, episode 174, I told you about Priya, who had a long-standing conflict with her mother-in-law, Penny. Penny constantly criticized Priya for speaking Hindi to her daughter, for cooking with Indian instead of American spices, and for having a career, which meant that she and her husband shared house chores. Priya found herself mentally spinning about arguments with Penny for years. She would cycle through thoughts like, Penny's so judgmental. Why can't she accept our choices? I'm not controlling. What happens in our household? It's because Willie and I make decisions together. And, I should just ignore her comments. Let it go, Priya. Isn't that what your meditation teacher always tells you? This mental spinning was exhausting her. So how did Priya work with her mental spinning? The first thing she did was that she tried taking the high road. She would smile politely when Penny made cutting remarks about confusing the child with two languages or suggesting Priya should be in charge of all the house chores. This approach left Priya feeling resentful, angry, and inauthentic. The pressure was building inside of her. Nothing was actually improving. Every time Penny visited, Priya felt more and more disconnected and angry. As we worked together, I helped Priya to turn her awareness towards her values. Instead of asking, how do I get Penny to stop criticizing me? Priya shifted to, how do I show up authentically while honoring my values? She identified that cultural heritage was important for her and for Willie. She also understood that partnership was valuable in her marriage, and that she also valued respect for different ways of life. After Priya was able to stay grounded in her values, she had a direct conversation with Penny that went more or less like this. Priya said, Penny, I notice you have concerns about how we are raising our daughter and running our household. I see that your concerns come from a deep care for your son, Willie, for our daughter, and the happiness of our family. I also think you care about me. I think you want me to succeed as a wife. I know how when you were a young mother like me, you decided to stop working outside the home to take care of your 4 kids. I can appreciate how loving that was. I want you to know that Willie and I are happy together. We talk a lot about the kind of family the two of us want. We both value our cultures, and we want to instill those values into our daughter. We both decided that speaking English and Hindi connects our daughter to her multicultural heritage, which matters deeply to us. We also value having a partnership where we both contribute to the household. We want to model for our daughter that she has two parents who take care of the house. Because as you very well know, there's always so much to do. When Penny heard all this, they were sitting on the couch. Penny got closer to Priya. She even reached out for Priya's hand. And then she told her that she knew that this generation was different than hers. She talked about how she would have loved that her husband, Willie's father, could help with chores when they were young. She even said, maybe it's just that I'm a little envious of how you get to have a career and also get to have support at home. And then she said, I know I sometimes make comments that are annoying. I'm afraid my granddaughter will be confused at school. At this point, Priya said, whenever you're concerned about us, I welcome you asking me a question about it. Talking about things we don't understand can be a great way for us to learn to respect each other's perspectives. As you can see, using the language alchemy approach, Priya went from avoidance to authentic dialogue. And that created space for genuine understanding rather than surface politeness. And while they didn't agree on everything, they found a way to coexist with mutual respect. Priya no longer carried the burden of her mental spinning. And her conversation with Penny brought more connection and harmony with her husband, Willie. This is the power of language alchemy. When we stop trying to be the better person and start being our authentic selves, grounded in our own values, we create the possibility for real resolution and genuine connection. If Priya's story reminds you of someone in your life, maybe a friend, family member, or a colleague who's been spinning in their own conflict, this might be exactly what they need to hear. So feel free to share this episode with them. And now let's recap what you've heard in this episode. Today we explored how to break free from the mental spin cycle of ongoing conflicts. First, we identified the better person trap, how trying to take the high road often leads to resentment and lack of authenticity. Then you learned about the three-part language alchemy approach: awareness of our mental spinning, shifting from right-wrong thinking to values-based communication, and engaging in evolutionary activism that creates ripple effects. You discovered how to transform your internal dialogue by asking different questions, moving from how do I make them change to how do I show up as my authentic self. Through Priya's example with her mother-in-law, Penny, we saw how this approach creates genuine dialogue and mutual respect, even when people don't fully agree. Remember, you do not have to be the better person. You just need to be your authentic self, grounded in your values. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with someone who might be caught in their own mental spin cycle. We all know someone who could use this approach to break free from exhausting conflicts. And if you are that person who's having a long-held conflict, you've been caught in the mental spin cycle, and you'd like to solve this conflict, then email me. And in the subject line of your email, write freedom from spin cycle. I will reply and tell you how we can work together so that, like Priya, you can learn to communicate with clarity, confidence, and compassion, and you can let go of the pain and exhaustion that long-standing conflict creates in your life and relationships. And what's my email? If you are in the Language Alchemy mailing list, then you have my direct email address. And if you haven't signed up for the Language Alchemy mailing list, then go to languagealchemy.com and subscribe there. Thank you so much for listening, and a special thanks to all my communication students and clients who have done the work to learn to break free from their mental spin cycle and communicate in alignment with their values. Until next episode, and as we say in Argentina, ciao ciao, original music from Gary LaPoe. You can find all links in the show notes at languagealchemy.com.